Tantor Audio presents The Horror of It All. One moviegoer's love affair with masked maniacs, frightened virgins, and the living dead. By Adam Rockoff. Narrated by R.C. Bray. It used to be drink, smoking, and drugs. Then there was a fourth thing, porn. And now there's a fifth, horror. Detective Superintendent Peter Kruger, head of Scotland Yard's Obscene Publications Squad. Prologue. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Those immortal words were almost certainly not written to anticipate the horror boom in the early years of the 21st century, and yet they most surely apply. It was the best of times because interest in horror movies, and all the accompanying cultural detritus, is at an all-time high. I just got back from Barnes & Noble, as good a barometer as any for measuring the zeitgeist. On this day, the magazine rack was stocked with no fewer than 11 titles devoted exclusively to horror and exploitation films. 11! And lest anyone think I'm exaggerating for effect, here they are. Fangoria, Rue Morgue, Scary Monsters Magazine, Diabolique, Horror Hound, Famous Monsters of Filmland, Shadowland Magazine, Film Facts, Videoscope, Video Watchdog, and The Walking Dead, the official magazine. There were exactly 0 magazines dedicated to westerns, none for comedies either, zilch for family films, dramas, and musicals. While there were also a handful of general entertainment periodicals, those publications included horror too, whenever it hit the mainstream. The 2011 Best Picture Oscar winner, The Artist, grossed a total of $44 million. That same year, in just its opening weekend, the third installment of the Paranormal Activity series grossed $52 million. This is just one example, but it's indicative of what a commercial juggernaut horror has become. If the genre is as healthy as it's ever been, how can it possibly also be the worst of times? Well, because as incredible as this might seem, the golden age of horror journalism, which I would argue we're in, has a downside. It seems as if everything worth writing has already been written. I love the Friday the 13th series as much as anyone, but after Peter M. Brackey's exhaustive, fully illustrated oral history, Crystal Lake Memories, as well as both Daniel Farrens's accompanying documentary adaptation and his earlier film, His Name Was Jason, 30 Years of Friday the 13th, there's absolutely nothing to add to the legacy of everyone's favorite hockey-masked maniac. We now have a handful of books I could legitimately describe as the definitive work on Dario Argento, and with Mario Bava, All the Colors of the Dark, and Beyond Terror, the films of Lucio Fulci, Tim Lucas and Stephen Thrower, respectively, have provided the final word on these Italian titans. I can't imagine anyone writing about the grindhouse and trash cinema more lovingly than Bill Landis and Michelle Clifford. And if a Peter Biskind-esque look at horror cinema's most famous feuds and faces is your thing, you probably can't do better than Jason Zinnemann's Shock Value, how a few eccentric outsiders gave us nightmares, conquered Hollywood, and invented modern horror. Or David Conau's Real Terror, the scary, bloody, gory 100-year history of classic horror films. I could go on and on, and on, and on. So, what's the problem with this embarrassment of riches? 20 years ago, when I was digging around the back of a moth-infested used bookstore for a battered copy of John McCarty's splatter movies, breaking the last taboo of the screen, I could never have dreamed that some Monday I would be able to order the biography of Peter Cushing, a history of horror fanzines, and a beautiful, full-color coffee table book showcasing Metallica guitarist Kirk Hammett's unparalleled horror memorabilia collection, only to have all of them arrive at my front door on Tuesday morning. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was only a problem for me. It had been over a decade since my first book, Going to Pieces, The Rise and Fall of the Slasher Film, came out, and I had been itching to write a follow-up. But about what? Then it hit me. I was in the bathroom reading Fargo Rock City for the umpteenth time, both on the toilet and in general. I know I sound like some hack comedian, but every single good idea I've ever had has come to me either in the shower or while emptying my bowels. For those of you who don't know, Fargo Rock City is Chuck Klosterman's memoir about growing up as a heavy metal fan in rural North Dakota. On the surface, it's both a history and critical analysis of hair metal, but filtered through Klosterman's personal experiences, it becomes something much more profound. What if I could do the same thing with horror movies? To my knowledge, this had never been done. Kayla Janice's masterful House of Psychotic Women comes close. But two things gave me reason to believe there might be room for another voice. One, and most obvious, Janice is a woman. We may like to pretend that gender has no effect on how we process art and culture, but that's a lie, and everyone knows it. Plus, her hardscrabble life was markedly different from my own uneventful suburban upbringing. Two, and this is equally apparent just from her book's subtitle, an autobiographical topography of female neurosis in horror and exploitation films. Janice is a far better writer than I'll ever be. This isn't false modesty. Unfortunately, I have plenty of examples to support this claim. The first testimonial, the very first one on the back cover of Going to Pieces, states, "Rockoff is no blood-in-his-eye moron." Have you ever heard such effusive praise? I might not be the smartest guy in the room, or the most eloquent, but hey, at least I'm no moron. I might as well be the thinnest guy at fat camp. Then there's the fact that a signed copy of my book is selling on eBay for less money than a brand new one. So I have the dubious distinction of being one of the lucky authors whose signature actually devalues the work. This reminds me of a hot dog stand near my hometown where a buttered roll actually cost less than a plain roll. As adventurous as my friends and I were, we never dared sample that butter. So, why waste your hard-earned money on this book? As a close friend of mine recently asked, who the hell wants to read about your experiences? Why is that interesting to anybody except for you? I realized two things. One, I need some new friends. But two, my experiences, while unique to me, are really nothing more than a window to your own. A mirror to reflect back those memories that may have been forgotten, misplaced, or shelved away in the furthest recesses of your mind. Part of the subtitle of this book is One Moviegoer's Love Affair. That's both true and misleading. I distinctly remember the first time I ever saw the 1978 film Class Reunion Massacre. On some level, I understood that hundreds of people were responsible for its conception, production, and release. Thousands more had eventually seen it in theaters or on home video. But the film itself was so weird, and my experience of watching it so personal, that at the time, I couldn't imagine anyone else even being aware of its existence. Once I started discussing horror films with like-minded fans, I soon learned that many people were indeed aware of Class Reunion Massacre. One or two had even seen it in some shitty theater under its original title, The Redeemer, Son of Satan. Then it became crystal clear. Although I can only write about my own experiences, I can draw on the collective consciousness of horror fandom, and this is why you might like this book, because my memories are yours. I'm almost 40 now, no longer the target demographic for horror movies, and yet I love them more than ever. Lots of my friends do, too. As someone who came of age during the slasher boom in the early 80s, I've seen the genre rise and fall and rise again. Since then, horror films have undergone more transformations than even Dr. Moreau could fathom. Scream ushered in an era of snarky, self-conscious postmodern horror. The Blair Witch Project obliterated the studio model and proved that any bozo with a camcorder could make a scary movie, while superior documentary-style films such as The Last Exorcism, The Devil Inside, and the Paranormal Activity series proved to be not the exception but the rule. The term torture porn was coined to describe the uncompromising films of Eli Roth and Rob Zombie, giving media pundits a perfect sobriquet for the objects of their derision. Films released barely 20 years earlier were remade or reimagined in droves, including each of the holy trinity of slasherdom: Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Vampires were sexy, then gritty, then sexy again, and eventually zombies were freaking everywhere. The time is once again ripe to ask the question, Why do horror films continue to not only endure, but prosper? It's a question that will be answered not by the cultural arbiters, forever frustrated by their inability to explain the allure of horror, but by someone on the front lines. Because to really understand the modern horror film, you have to live it. You have to embrace the outre, dive headfirst into the rabbit hole with eyes wide open, or shut, and not be afraid to slay the sacred cows. And for those of us who do, it's a hell of a ride. Chapter 1. Crawling to Babylon. In second grade, there's nothing I would have liked more than to have seen my teacher, Mrs. Glassman, meet her demise at the business end of Jason Voorhees' machete. I don't mean this euphemistically. I really would have loved to come to school one day only to learn that she had been hacked to death by a madman. After all, she deserved it. An adorable little girl named Erica Steinberg sat next to me in class. She was sweet, with a wonderful sense of humor, which meant she laughed at my painfully unfunny juvenile jokes. She was also pathologically shy and terrified of speaking in class. I'm certain the thought of being called on filled her days with dread. Mrs. Glassman picked up on this vulnerability almost immediately, but instead of gently leading Erica out of her shell, emphatically encouraging her to find her voice, Mrs. Glassman badgered her incessantly, demanding she speak up and contribute. Believe me, this wasn't a calculated strategy to show Erica there was nothing to be afraid of. It wasn't like the time I scooped up my nervous son and slid with him down the water slide, knowing full well that if he did it once he'd want to do it 50 million more times. This wasn't even an old-school teacher demonstrating tough love. This was cruelty, plain and simple. Then there was Don Ross. Today he would no doubt be diagnosed with a variety of syndromes and conditions and monitored round the clock by a group of specialists. But back in 1982 he was just considered rambunctious. One day Don was desperately trying to explain something to Mrs. Glassman, just get out a single thought, and she kept cutting him off. Naturally, this made him more and more frustrated, and for a kid who is naturally high-strung, frustration is like rocket fuel. Instead of giving Don time to cool off, Mrs. Glassman threatened him with detention. When he wouldn't stop protesting, she said that's one day. Naturally, that just made Don angrier, but she just ignored him, as if he wasn't even there. And with an evil smile, she continued adding days to his sentence. That's 2. That's 3. That's 4. A few years later, an almost identical scene would be played out in the Breakfast Club. The only difference is that John Bender was a legitimate juvenile delinquent who pulled false fire alarms and hid his dope in Brian Johnson's underwear. Don Ross was a good kid with emotional problems. Who knows on what number Mrs. Glassman eventually stopped, or if cooler heads eventually prevailed and the excessive punishment was reduced. It's irrelevant. What matters is that Mrs. Glassman saw a child who was in desperate need of help, of guidance, of consolation, and her first instinct was to hurt him. Now, are the above 2 stories the absolute worst things that could ever happen to a child? Of course not. I mean, for Christ's sakes, in 19 states in the Union, teachers are still allowed to hit their students. For real. We spend billions on education reform, yet give teachers the right to beat the shit out of the kids in their care. But there are fewer trusts more sacred, at least in the other 31 more enlightened states, than that between a teacher and an impressionable student, and Mrs. Glassman obliterated that. Since I displayed no obvious weakness, although if my report card is any indication I was a pretty obnoxious chatterbox, I never personally felt her wrath. That is, until the class was given a writing assignment in which we had to describe what we enjoyed doing when we weren't in school. My essay wasn't so much a description of my favorite pastimes as it was a laundry list of about 24 horror films. I had seen maybe 1 or 2 of them, such as Jaws and Dracula. The rest were titles from the cable guide that seemed especially enticing. Logical choices such as Terror Train, Friday the 13th, Visiting Hours, Happy Birthday to Me, and Night School were interspersed with some puzzling selections like The Octagon, Fighting Back, and something called Fire at the Grove, which I have to assume is a long-lost TV movie since I can't find a single reference to it anywhere. I ended the essay by saying I like to go and visit the zoo, too. If I had never seen the majority of these films, what then compelled me to list them? And why did I claim that this was how I liked to spend my free time? It all began with The Elephant Man. I was 6 years old when I saw the visage of Joseph Carey Merrick, although since it was in the movie it was actually the face of John Hurt, brilliantly transformed by Christopher Tucker's revolutionary makeup. That was the first time I can actually remember being terrified. Since I was an extraordinarily sensitive child, as demonstrated by my precise recollection of Mrs. Glassman's offenses, I was even more disturbed by the indignities inflicted upon Merrick by the miscreants of Victorian London than I was by the man's actual deformities. Nature's malice I could accept. That of my fellow man was infinitely more upsetting. Even before The Elephant Man, I knew that the world could be a dark and fearsome place. This revelation came from an unlikely source. Most people are familiar with the elephant Babar, as either the main character in a series of classic children's books or as the punchline in one of the funniest scenes from Fletch. But to me, he was an unwitting guide into life's ugliness. There's a page in Babar the King where a herd of winged elephants representing positive values such as courage, kindness, intelligence, and hope chase away their malevolent doppelgangers, cowardice, anger, stupidity, and despair. The leader of the baddies is Misfortune, a sickly old woman riding some crazy-looking horned giraffe-like thing. Her minions look no less disturbing. Spinelessness is a humanoid gremlin, while sickness is a dachshund blowing smoke from its elongated snout. Eventually, my mother had to hide the book. When she asked me why I was so frightened of these specific illustrations from a children's book, no less, I couldn't articulate it, but I knew. It was as clear as day. Abstract concepts had been given a face, albeit a crudely drawn one, which was more than enough for my pre-adolescent brain to process as a tangible threat. I might not have known what discouragement meant, but now that I could see it in the form of a porcine monster, I was absolutely convinced that it was coming straight for me. So what did I do? I did what any kid would do. I slept in my parents' bedroom far more often than I'd like to admit. Ironically, it was there, ensconced in the safety of Goosedown, that one morning I witnessed something that made the benign terrors of Babar pale by comparison. It was an anti-smoking public service announcement, and its final image is forever seared into my memory. The entire PSA was comprised of a single shot of a woman holding up a black-and-white photograph in front of her face. The subject in the photo is attractive, or at least pleasant-looking in a 50s housewife kind of way. She begins telling a story about how her husband fell asleep while smoking in bed, presumably with her in it. A fire ensued, and her husband perished in the blaze. The entire time the camera moves closer and closer to the photograph until the woman says, "I guess you could say I was the lucky one." She then lowers the photo. Holy fucking shit. Suddenly, the Elephant Man was Cary Grant. I had never seen anything so profoundly disturbing. The woman had been burned beyond recognition. Her face, or what was left of it, was nothing more than a mass of melted flesh, strips of scar tissue crisscrossing each other at unnatural angles. Mercifully, the image was only on TV for a few seconds before cutting away to whatever Saturday morning cartoon followed it. From then on, the moment I saw the first frame of that commercial, I would dive underneath the covers until I heard her final, bitterly ironic line of dialogue. I guess you could say I was the lucky one. For years, her voice was the soundtrack to 1,000 nightmares. I have absolutely no idea who directed this PSA. Probably just some journeyman who went on to make commercials hawking potato chips and antifungal cream, but some enterprising producer should find this dude and sign him up, although he's probably retired or dead by now. Just typing in various search terms, trying to find any information at all on this PSA, literally sends shivers up my spine. I'm not exaggerating when I say it remains the most terrifying 30 seconds of video I have ever seen. But the Elephant Man, Babar, and the lady who got burned had nothing on the scariest film. To this day, it's one of only a handful of movies that I still refuse to watch alone in the dark. When my wife and I started dating, I tried to give it another go, and it still freaked me the fuck out. This movie is the Walt Disney Company's 1980 release, The Watcher in the Woods. The plot of the film is almost inconsequential. A couple and their 2 daughters temporarily move into a huge English manor. Mrs. Aylwood, Betty Davis, the estate's owner, notices that one of the children, Jan, bears a striking resemblance to her teenage daughter who mysteriously disappeared nearly 30 years earlier. The melodrama is just background noise. The only thing that matters is that Watcher contains some of the most haunting images ever captured on celluloid. Laugh if you want, but the shot of a blindfolded Karen Aylwood reaching out in desperation while mouthing the words "Help me" is as bone-chilling as anything from The Haunting or The Uninvited. The fact that this specter only appears when Jan looks at her own reflection makes it all the more unsettling. Between this and The Legend of Bloody Mary, I spent most of my childhood avoiding mirrors at all costs. Of course, at the time, I knew nothing about the troubled history of Watcher, whose production and theatrical release were a monumental clusterfuck. Watcher was born out of Disney's desire to make more adult-themed films, following their success with The Black Hole. What ensued, however, was a struggle between producer Tom Leach and studio brass about how un-Disney a Disney film should ultimately be. The film's ending was a point of particular contention for all involved. Watcher was rushed into theaters to capitalize on star Betty Davis's 50th anniversary in the entertainment industry. As a result, the groundbreaking special effects planned for the final scene were jettisoned in favor of an ending that was less complicated to shoot, and completely incoherent. Even in an era where star power actually meant something, can you think of a dumber reason to either see or not see a film? Because of some arbitrary date related to the leading lady's history? If I told my wife we couldn't see the next Sex and the City installment because I wanted to wait for the 35th anniversary of Square Pegs, she'd rightly have me committed. Predictably, when Watcher was released in theaters, audiences were confused. But when it hit video soon after, it attracted a whole generation of rabid fans like myself, one less concerned about narrative cohesion than cheap thrills. Kids who came to sit on Uncle Walt's lap, but instead got their fright card. Even today, I can still give my 36-year-old sister a heart attack by writing Narek, Karen spelled backward, a plot point in the film, into the condensation on a window. Recently I was at a film festival where Gary Sherman, one of the horror film's most underrated directors, Deathline, Dead and Buried, Vice Squad, was talking about how his interest in the genre stemmed from a traumatic event from his childhood. The bodies of 3 young boys were found naked and bound in a forest preserve near his Chicago home, a case that received national attention as the Schuessler-Peterson murders. Since the victims were around his age, Sherman was terrified. An astute child, he heard that the best way to combat a fear was to learn as much as possible about it. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was a defense mechanism. So Sherman immersed himself in serial killers and aberrant psychology. I did the same thing with horror movies. But curiously, after dozens of viewings of Watcher, I noticed something else was happening. Although I was scared shitless of the film, literally jumping off the couch each time a mirror would shatter and Karen's ghostly countenance would appear, I kind of liked the feeling. I felt energized, rejuvenated, alive. I became a fear junkie. Now this doesn't mean I was a particularly brave addict. I watched Friday the 13th Part 3 standing in the doorway of my living room, peering around the doorframe in case the tension became so unbearable that I had to scurry back to the safety of the kitchen. Just the poster for curtains, with the image of a small doll coming through the elongated mouth of an old crone mask, shook me up so badly that I couldn't even bring myself to watch the film when it first made the rounds on cable. So every new horror film became a test, a game to see how much fear I could handle. Like all addicts, I eventually built up a tolerance, and the more films I watched, the more I fell in love with them. With their colorful villains and breathtaking monsters, mind-bending plots and phantasmagoric imagery. Even their rather reassuring worldview. Except for a few daring and downbeat examples, good usually triumphed over evil. Although slasher films were certainly the most prevalent subgenre at the time, I sought out all flavors of horror. Gothic ghost stories, Cold War parables, 70s devil films, forgotten independent oddities. Even the dusty old Universal classics and their marginally faster-paced Hammer films Spawn held interest, as I understood that they were part of a lineage that seemed to grow richer and more compelling with every passing generation. Concurrent with my burgeoning love of horror, seismic changes were taking place in the film industry. The early days of home video were a vast wasteland, mainly of pornography and weird promotional infomercials. Short-sighted as usual, the Hollywood studios were initially wary of this new technology. Just as they had feared nearly every other technological innovation since the birth of the medium, they were convinced it was going to completely upend their business model. Ironically, by the time the DVD market cratered in the late 2000s, home video had come to make up a disproportionate share of the industry's profits. Because discs were priced so low, even casual film buffs could afford to build their own home library. You could buy a new, digitally remastered version of Casablanca for hardly more than it once cost to rent it at Blockbuster, especially if you factored in the inevitable late fees. An unintended result of the studio's trepidation was an immediate boom in low-budget home video distributors, which sprang up to meet the public's insatiable desire for product. Since these distributors couldn't get their hands on studio releases, they were forced to fill their pipelines with the only films they were able to license. More often than not, horror and exploitation titles. This was a game-changer. Before this, these B-movies could only be seen in independent theaters, usually in large cities and at the occasional drive-in, which were already few and far between. Although I lived only 45 minutes from 42nd Street, the mecca of the famed grindhouses, I had as much chance of visiting these flea pits as I did Kathmandu. We went into Manhattan exactly once a year around Christmas to catch a Broadway musical and gawk at Macy's holiday window displays. And although I would have gladly traded in my Guys and Dolls or Oklahoma tickets for a showing of Women in Cages or the Corpse Grinders, I seriously doubt anyone else in my family would have considered this an appropriate holiday excursion. Once sleaze became available to consume in the privacy of one's home, the grindhouses lost much of their appeal, unless you were an exhibitionist or Pee Wee Herman. The dilapidated seats, atrocious acoustics, and cum-covered floor weren't accoutrements worth preserving. More recently, we've seen a similar scenario play itself out with pornography, as physical media like magazines and videos and DVDs have gone the way of the dinosaurs. It's all about safety, convenience, and cost. The more I think about it, the more baffling it is that there's still a market for any non-internet distributed porn. How many copies of Swank can the Pakistani owner of my local liquor store possibly be selling? And to whom? Who in their right mind would shell out 15 bones for a single issue in light of the free and unlimited selection online? And while we're on the topic, what kind of lunatic purchases pornography at an airport newsstand? But a lot of people do, right? I mean, literally every airport I've ever been in has a robust selection of dirty magazines. There must be a compelling reason for them to keep stocking this smut, and that reason can only be that there's still a demand for it. Forget religious profiling, which I really don't have a problem with. We would be well served if TSA agents focused most of their attention on travelers buying airport porn, because any person who must have it now and can't wait until they return to the privacy of their home or hotel room isn't the kind of person you want roaming the cabin at 30,000 feet. What do they plan to do with it anyway? Join the Mile High Club with themselves? Plus, anyone who has no compunction about buying porn not only in public, but in an airport of all places, in plain view of babies, grandparents, and Franciscan nuns, is obviously a deeply disturbed individual. That said, I sort of feel bad for kids today. After all, trying to procure pornography before you're old enough is a noble, time-honored tradition. Disabling the net nanny on the family computer can't possibly hold the same illicit thrill as trying to buy dirty magazines at the corner store, holding your breath in anticipation while the teenage clerk decides which is more important, enforcing the store's age restrictions or possibly pocketing a $5. Believe it or not, I still have my family's very first VCR displayed in my office as a retro conversation piece. It's a behemoth of a machine that came with a remote control connected to the system by an actual cord. Ironically, I'd love such an obsolete feature today, as I spend an inordinate amount of time searching between the cushions of the couch for one of our 50,000 remotes. In November 2013.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?